Now, this video is really interesting because it brought back a memory of something really disturbing that happened to me at Disneyland. Probably the last time I haven't been in a long time. I don't go. I've completely blacklisted Disneyland from my life. But I think this was like in the 90s around the time they're talking about in this video. I was on the Space Mountain ride, and we got on the ride and we got strapped in, and the weird thing about this ride is like really dark. So you don't see the track, you don't see where you're going, you just feel like your movement through space, through darkness. And I had been on this ride in the past, so I knew what to expect. But we got on the ride and it became downright terrifying. Like, I have never experienced anything like it on a ride. It was like the thing went out of control and it began to go so incredibly fast that I was fearing for my life. It's like the speed control just went overboard and it felt like I was physically going to die from the how fast we were going. It was like my body couldn't take it. It was scary. Like I was really just like shocked and traumatized. And we got off the ride and I turned around and they completely shut it down after that. Like they stopped running the ride and so I knew something had to be wrong with the ride. But I'm just glad that the car didn't fly off the rails or something because it was weird.
Late 1990s and early 2000s, the Disneyland Resort faced a number of serious incidents, including several severe injuries and even a few deaths. As this has been covered in the media, one person was killed and several injured in a malfunction of the sailing ship Columbia ride in 1998. Following an extensive investigation by California Department of Health and Safety, Disney was fined for serious violations, including failure to adequately train park employees, implement proper safety features, or even maintain attractions correctly. The accidents continued into the early 2000s, including a collision on the Big Thunder Mountain Railroad that killed one guest and maimed several others. Mysteriously, several high-level park employee officials were fired during this time, some of which later filed whistleblower lawsuits. One manager at the park warned Disney officials of the poor safety of the attractions in 1996 and was subsequently laid off. It does seem bizarre that such a wealthy corporation would have such poor standards of maintenance. However, each Disney park does generally run separately with an independent set of finances. During the late 1990s, the California park ran into significant economic troubles with lower than expected attendance, partly due to competition with the new nearby Six Flags park. The local resort management simply could not afford to continue the quality of maintenance one would expect from a Disney park. Budgets were slashed, operations and services suffered, and several people died or were injured as a result. At least this is the official narrative. Disney Corp claimed that out of a population of nearly 650 million visitors to Disneyland Park in its history, chances of death or injury are negligible for guests. However, as a park employee from 1994 to 2003, I can safely say that this number of reported deaths barely scratches the surface. While the park may have significantly improved with its prior status, some pretty bizarre shit happened in the late 90s, only a small fraction of which has been picked up by the mainstream media or noticed by investigators or even Disney management itself. As a 9-year worker under Mickey Mouse, a large amount of incredibly strange stuff happened, some of which I am at a loss to explain. In the summer of 1994, after graduating from Anaheim Community College, I landed a job as a ride operator at Disney, located only a few miles from my apartment. I was offered a great paycheck and had the benefits of working in a familiar place of childhood nostalgia. The work itself was pretty simple, loading guests onto the rides, making sure that all the rides were secure, and then controlling the attraction from the dashboard. Disney had just implemented a new ride control system using computerized panel and video cameras to keep watch over the ride. At first, my employment seemed great. While the shifts could be a little bit monotonous, the salary was very high and I was able to move away from my small apartment into a townhouse farther from the park. But for these reasons, while I was considering the job only for a temporary position over the summer, I decided to stay with Disney for a longer time. This is the point where stuff begins to get a little, well, strange. In the spring of '95, Disney made all the park employees sign a somewhat disconcerting contract barring us from discussing park operations with members of the public. This essentially meant that I would be unable to talk about my job with my friends and family. It also meant that any whistleblowers who complained about safety in the attractions could be laid off. Some of my fellow workers were outraged. Personally, the contract did not really concern me, as I had no reason to discuss the specifics of my work with members of the general public. It was also at the time, in April or May of '95, that anomalies started to occur. These were somewhat minor but also disturbing events that confused me and my fellow ride operators. For example, while running the Matterhorn bobsleds once, I strapped in two young brothers, probably 5 or 6 years old. I sat down at the dashboard to keep track of the ride. The next thing is, I never saw the brothers' bobsled on any of the monitors. It's as if they had vanished. Naturally, I was somewhat disturbed and assumed that their car had broken down at some point on the track and thus was unable to continue to the other sections of the track that were monitored by the video cameras. However, the other cars continued to move along the track. After about 7 minutes after I had sent off the two younger kids, their car mysteriously arrived back at the station, despite apparently not travelling through any of the monitored sections of rail. Even stranger, the ride typically only takes a couple of minutes to complete, and 7 minutes is almost unheard of. The two kids, upon stepping out of the ride, seemed somehow disturbed. While not seeming afraid or traumatized in any way, they just seemed a bit confused and disorientated. After they left the ride, I never saw them in the park again. After reporting this incident to my superiors, I was ignored. One park official even threatened me. This would be the first of such an anomaly, and their cast member team would see a considerable number of such events in the future. Some of these incidents were explainable. Park officials claimed that the video camera equipment was probably malfunctioning and that the young kids sometimes just played pranks on us ride operators. It occurred often. The maintenance team even had a running joke about keeping track of which ride vehicles were haunted. By 1996, my fellow employees and I had estimated that approximately 5% of the rides on Matterhorn were anomalies. It was around this time that the incidents began to spread to other parts of the park. Ride operators at Splash Mountain began reporting similar events, and soon after, within a few months, anomalies were occurring all over the park. Official management were no help. We decided simply to ignore the problem, knowing that at least guests would always exit the ride safely, even if somewhat disorientated. It was in the January of 1997 that we realised the severity of the situation. A brother and sister, probably 8 or 9 years old, had entered Splash Mountain on one of the smaller ride vehicles. They did not show up on any of the ride monitors, waiting over 2 hours with their car failing to return to the station. The park had reached closing time and we were ordered to shut the ride down. Our team sent in Tim, a fellow maintenance operator, to search for the children. He never exited the ride. Walking out of the park that night, I swear I could see the faces of those children, vaguely, in the mist at the edges of Fantasyland. Due to the nature of our contract, we were unable to discuss any of these events with anyone. Several of my fellow employees quit shortly after that, but I decided to stay as I badly needed the money. Throughout 97 and 98, we counted several dozen such disappearances, with riders never even exiting the rides. Strangely, despite the vanishing of several children, we never received any complaints from parents who naturally should have been inquiring as to where their children are. What kind of a parent would just leave their kids at Disneyland? This was about the same time as some of the reported accidents at the park, ultimately leading to a major investigation. Many in the media blamed these events on poor maintenance, but I sensed that something far darker was occurring. In 2003, I ultimately left Disneyland. This story really has no point that I can see. I have little idea what happened in Disneyland during those years, and if anybody has any leads, please just let me know. During the late